Well, it's great to welcome everybody here. First of all, again, thanks for joining us for our 2010 Industrial Affiliates meeting. We really enjoy having you here, and we hope you have a great day and a great evening with us as well. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Lyndon Rhodes to talk to us. Lyndon took over 2 years ago as the head of, for what's now the University of Washington Center for Commercialization. So this is a reboot of the Tech Transfer Office. I described that process to some of you this morning. So we're extremely excited to have Lyndon here. She's somebody who those of us in computer science and engineering have known for a couple of decades. She's a Seattle entrepreneur who was involved in a number of our startup companies in the 1990s and has been a friend of our department for a long time and a friend of the tech and entrepreneurial community in Seattle. It's a real change having an entrepreneur run a university tech transfer office, and what Lyndon's going to talk to us about today is a set of changes she's been making at the UW Center for Commercialization and how we all work with C4C to increase the flow of ideas and people and technologies between the University of Washington and companies. So Lyndon, thanks a million for joining us here today.
Well, it's great to be here at this department. I've had so much affection for so long. I think the University of Washington has benefited greatly from the leadership of this department caring so much about tech transfer and tech transfer being done well here. And I wouldn't have wanted this job but for their passion for seeing it done well, and I wouldn't have had the opportunity, I think, to be considered for it but for them. So I've taken it with a grain of salt when, despite their tremendous general support, every once in a while, because they do care so much, there's been the inevitable flame email about our efforts. And it occurred to me as I was driving here today that maybe this invitation was the most lovely retraction, public retraction one could imagine. And then a few minutes later, as I was crossing the Montlake Bridge, it occurred to me that actually maybe this was the most clever of opportunities to self-substantiate any concerns and complaints. So with thoughts about that anxiety, and this is going to be a little bit of a long preamble, it then occurred to me to remember that in the first months that I was here, I was very, very comfortable and secure. And that surprised many in the innovation ecosystem, fellow entrepreneurs and venture capitalists who would ask me if I was nervous to be leading a unit with so many team members who were far more educated and erudite in this area than myself, and who in life science understood that there's a difference between small molecules and biologics. And I would tell them, no, I actually feel really good and really comfortable. And after a couple of months, I realized that that was largely because after 2 decades of working for companies that in the most part I had helped found, this was the first time I was working for an entity where it wasn't within the very real possibility that we would go out of business, and very soon. And that was pretty thought-provoking. Because it meant that many of the strategies which I had really focused on implementing in startup companies weren't necessarily going to translate well to this environment. And so, for example, the idea that cash is king and that you have to manage by walking around and reminding everyone constantly that cash is more important than my mother. In my culture, that's surprising to say. That wasn't really the key focus. And so, the University of Washington isn't going to be out of business in a decade. And so the challenge and the responsibility of leadership here is a very different one. It's to, while we're guaranteed to be in business, there is no corollary guarantee that we will be as significant a force in the world, that our graduates will be prepared to contribute as significantly to addressing the major problems facing the planet and the country, that the research we do will have as great an impact as it does today, or as it might even more greatly in the future. And so our strategies have to really think about that issue instead of survival. And that's interesting to think about too, because in startups largely, or even in industry, much of the strategy is strategy and it's top down. And universities, I've figured out, are largely, and no one told me this until I was here, bottoms-up efforts by thousands of faculty with their own ideas and opportunistic. And so I think what's interesting about this effort is that it's one of the few that really thinks about the university strategically over the next decades and attempts to in large degree and in partnership with many others, be tops-down and strategic. So before I talk about changing, I guess I just wanted to acknowledge that this department has a history of greatness already and is already great and should be incredibly proud of the role it's occupied in the region, generating so many tech startups and of course so many very talented people who work for so many even more established or larger companies. Just to quibble for a moment with the WTIA, I'd like to point out that had certain companies that were spin-outs of UW spin-outs, very closely affiliated technically, or not licensed formally, been included, I think we would have tied for Saturn right now in that celestial map. We would have tied with Microsoft as Jupiter. So I thought I should provide some context, which is that largely the way that universities are is a result of federal policy realities. I don't know if every faculty member, I mean, we're so good at winning federal grant support, maybe because we're the beneficiaries of this policy, we don't want to criticize it, but certainly the American people, the American citizens are the most dedicated and brave and committed and generous venture capitalists in the world because we've been investing billions of dollars of public funds in research. And over the decades, as we, to some degree, subsidize corporate R&D with these investments, some would argue and complain and be concerned that over time, more and more of this research that's being funded is less and less related to development within companies. There has been an increased call for impact lately. I don't know if you've noticed it, but particularly in life sciences, and I have a feeling that energy is next. There are many, many articles in magazines like Newsweek and newspapers like the New York Times asking with specific reference to the NIH, where are the cures? Why isn't all of this money resulting in more valuable therapies and diagnostics and cures and other solutions? We all know that as a percentage basis of funding, of research funding, commercialization funds, SBIRs, and other funds are very, very low. And really, it is that federal policy which has created the valley of death that we all talk about so much, that very dangerous momentum crushing time between the ending of research funding and the moment when a company actually could have made enough progress to attract outside capital and outside risk. And the fact that SBIR grants, at least at this time, cannot be awarded to venture-backed companies, I think really leads to the very real possibility of adverse selection, where many of the best startups aren't eligible. Early on, when I was talking about researchers as to some degree running a business and being business people within the university, I think Ornazioni very wisely told me that this wouldn't culturally go over very well. So I'm not saying that researchers are business people necessarily and that they're running a business, but I will say that universities have to have a business model. And that is the change in this business model that I believe, and by the way, this is my individual opinion, is not necessarily universally or even majority subscribed to by other UW leadership, but it's my feeling that there's going to be a rapid change in funding, the funding model, and that's going to necessitate that rare, rapid response that sometimes takes place at moments of great necessity at even universities. Universities are funded largely by undergraduate tuition. And if you think about it, with the increase of online education being available, probably these 101 classes, Psychology 101, English 101, Spanish 101, calculus, initial calculus, are probably going to be the very easiest to offer in a high quality, value proposition way online. And so you have to think about what that's going to do to undermine this funding model. Ed Lazowska used a brilliant analogy. He said, when the internet came into being, many, many folks said that newspapers were going to be put out of business. And what they meant by that was that physical newspapers were going to be depopularized and wouldn't be able to compete with online either newspapers or news sources. And then several years went by, maybe even a decade, it didn't happen. And everyone said, see, it didn't happen. And then overnight, it did happen for a different reason. And the reason was that online media sources, news, became not the best way to advertise. And it turns out that the New York Times doesn't cost the dollar to produce that you pay for it. It really costs something like $5 even for the weekly version, and it's subsidized for the consumer who still likes it by advertisement. And we like it, but we don't like it $5. So basically today, these advertisers are instead investing in keyword search in engines and search engines, and there's just a tremendous dearth of revenue opportunity and funding for newspapers, and that's probably one of the reasons the Seattle PI isn't around today. So you have to think about what's going to happen if one day overnight, despite the fact that so many in academic leadership are saying, see, online education isn't killing bricks and mortar, in-person education, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be a rapid shift at some point. Secondly, for all the $1 billion+ that we bring in at the university in research, at least using some metrics and some perspective, research is actually subsidized. So even when we charge an indirect that helps fund the payroll and the janitorial services and everything else, on some levels you could say, now people who dispute it would say, well, it's the way we fund in this country graduate students, et cetera. But certainly you could argue that research is subsidized, and so if undergraduate tuition goes away at a time when state support is on the wane, there's a real problem in the existing business model. Collaboration with industry is minimal, and what I mean by that is that we love to talk about that $1 billion in research number here, but only about 3% of it. I love the fact that it's base 10 because it's the only reason I can do the math. So only about 30 million of that is sponsored by industry research. And even at the universities, which are far more successful at attracting sponsorship from industry, and it isn't actually clear to me whether it's that they're more successful in attracting that industry support or they're less successful than our researchers are at winning federal support. But at any rate, the highest numbers you usually see would be 7 or 8%. So minimal compared to government support. So if you believe that there's going to be a global market for online education and that we're going to be competing in a global market and not just with WSU or the regionals or community colleges for our positioning, then I would argue, and again, not everyone subscribes to this idea, that we're going to have to play to our strengths, and our international strengths completely reside in our tremendous reputation for doing research. So we should be emphasizing research and hands-on participation, integrating that with our undergraduate educational mission, because that can't be replicated online, focusing on these higher level courses that rely on very senior science and technology faculty, and collaborating with industry. And so, as I said in the I think subtitle to this talk, I really believe that a decade from now, it'll be those universities that figured out the very complicated and thorny problem of collaborating successfully with industry and focusing to some extent on translational research that are more significant and important in the world. And I think that that's why the university and C4C really need to, as part of that, lead in creating a model or a solution for commercialization that actually works. And one thing that would solve is an interesting cultural problem. It's a trend here at the university, I think, to say that certain departments or schools are not exactly monolithically on board with commercialization, as if somehow the problem is that they aren't modern, or they don't care about impact, or they only care about grant-willing ability. But actually, in fact, it's because, to a certain extent, there are financial realities that they absolutely must live up to being able to satisfy. And unless the commercialization model financially contributes and works, they can't afford that culture that we'd like them to have. I think if we're going to be a significant university, thinking out a decade and acting now, if we're going to collaborate with industry, that really requires that we also are doing the research with the greatest impact on society and supporting it with unparalleled commercialization support, such that we know that that research is going to have results. Collaborating with industry isn't very easy, and I think it really is a very different risk-reward profile than universities have traditionally been comfortable with. And I think even if you seek, for one thing, we're uncomfortable about reputationally being connected with a company that might have scandal or not do well. And even if you attempt to associate only with blue chip companies, I think WAMU is a great example of the fact. And I actually used to hold out Berkeley's $500 million energy research partnership with BP as the gold standard that we were trying to achieve. And of course, if you think about it, even partnering with very large companies doesn't immunize you against the possibility that you're going to be affiliated with a company that has problems. And of course, we have very different motivations. Academia tends to want to do research that focuses on outcomes that would be significant many additional years out than the next generation of product. And of course, very significantly wants to share those research results and publish them and collaborate with other researchers at other institutions. I cannot tell you how many times as a founder and entrepreneur, it nearly killed me with anxiety when our engineers wanted to go to SIGGRAPH for any reason other than to poach researchers from California. When they wanted to submit papers or tell me it was a good thing that someone wanted them to give a paper, I almost had a heart attack. So that's pretty much the universal feeling. Faculty don't want to be contract engineers, or at least the best faculty who we're thinking about don't want to be contract engineers. They want their research to be driven by their imagination, and to some degree, what they're aware the federal agencies are interested in funding. They don't really tend to think about the needs of customers, products, and competitiveness. And usually the tech transfer goal is to realize the very best licensing opportunity, the opportunity for the greatest revenue for the university, for the greatest success in the marketplace, and not necessarily reflexively granting an exclusive license to a research sponsor. And certainly we like to think about non-exclusive licensing programs, whereas companies that are going to sponsor research are often interested in the possibility of a commercial, non-exclusive, revenue-free, perpetual, sub-licensable license. In fact, if they could really achieve it, maybe just consulting agreements with the experts within the university versus formal sponsored research. We at the university tend to, along, interestingly enough, with pharmaceutical companies, lobby strongly for strong patent protection, and what I like to call the infringers lobby, software and semiconductors companies, which which basically their market is created by market dominance and monopolies, and they're petrified of the idea that a small inventor could stand in the way of a product and their ability to do very well with it just by virtue of their position in the market, tend to be lobbying very strongly for patent reform in the wrong direction. So how are we going to partner with industry despite all of these obstacles? And I certainly don't have all the answers, so these are just I think, a few of the initial ideas that will get us on our way. But the first thing that we have to do, and we have industry relations officers, an incredible new team of them here at the university, working with the College of Engineering, among others, and our office, is try to ensure that increasingly our researchers are doing the research with the greatest impact. And the Kaufman Foundation did a really interesting study a couple years ago in looking at that complaint that academic researchers were increasingly working away from the D. And not surprisingly, they discovered that the single greatest factor that could influence more relevant research was exposure of academic researchers to their counterparts in industry. And so we, by hiring this group of industry relations officers, have a number of programs whereby we hope to increase general truck with the university, even beyond and before we think about sponsored research or dollars. Industry affiliate programs like today's, and consortiums around centers of research and interdisciplinary efforts by industry members who are very interested in seeing those research outcomes go forward. Industry visits, having regularly docketed and scheduled meetings with many of the large pharmaceutical companies and semiconductor companies and software companies, where we know in advance that they're coming to talk about graphics in May and want to send their very best researchers to talk about what they're working on and to hear the work of ours. And we've got people coming to talk about databases in August. We're a university that's known for novel ways to commercialize research, and one of those is subscription on a non-exclusive basis to data and outcomes and ideas as commercialization, and we need to think more about that. We've had need, frankly, largely because of the success of researchers in computer science and engineering in attracting very important offers from important companies to spend time with them, to become very creative and flexible and open to thinking about conflict of interest in IP terms when it comes to leaves of absence and sabbaticals. And I'll talk a little bit more about that maybe. And then I think that one of the ways we can work around our differences in objectives and intellectual property needs with industry is to have sometimes what gives us, I think, a little bit of consternation because it isn't ultimately flexible, which is long-term partnerships with certain companies, like Scripps' partnership with, for $20 million with a given pharmaceutical company, where because of the long-term nature of the relationship, their interests become increasingly aligned. But first and foremost, we're going to have to continue to attract the top researchers. University is, in many ways, the collective reputation of its faculty, and top researchers and graduate school candidates in the highest demand areas, which are often these days code for commercially relevant, increasingly really care about commercialization. And one reason that we know that is that we're increasingly at C4C, I think Rick Lefebvre is going to get a major in this function, asked to go to dinners and lunches with those that we're really most hoping to land over Berkeley landing them, both graduate students and faculty candidates, to talk about what we do, to really show that we're actually going to be exceptional or are increasingly exceptional in this area, and in working with industry as well as thinking about licensing opportunities or startups. And in fact, many of these candidates want to know that the region, not only the university, but the whole region is a hotbed of entrepreneurial activity, and that we have a vital innovation ecosystem with a great funding base of venture capitalists and angel investors. And in addition to resources, in addition to specialists of the nature that I'm going to talk about, increasingly we've had to orient the university from a policy perspective around being favorable to researchers considering commercialization activities. And that's something very new, and that's a change that we've made very, very rapidly. I think there must be plenty of folks at the university who have the privilege of advocating for the value of basic research. And I'm the first one to acknowledge that if you don't understand the basic nature of electrons, you're never going to get to the transistor. But that being said, there are limited federal dollars, especially lately, and many, many very large and scary, thorny problems facing the country and the planet. And so it's my privilege and C4C's privilege to advocate for increasingly translational research. I think if we're going to see that here, we're going to have to some extent, when we have open faculty slots, have chairs who prioritize that in hiring and think not only about the visibility as to prospective faculty members' possibility and probability of winning research funding. I think the more we have successes in the lab next door, the more we're going to nothing motivates people like seeing their neighbor be successful. So C4C thinks about that a lot, that if we just focus on the 80-20 rule and helping a few researchers be massively successful, that will probably achieve more than any outreach program could, and inspiring other researchers to think more translationally about what they're doing. We need to have a revenue distribution model that rewards not only the individual researchers, but buys culture in a sense by rewarding departments and schools. It's a reality that faculty have to pick up more work when their colleagues engage in commercialization sometimes. Committee assignments and classes that they'd expected these entrepreneurial faculty to take on sometimes are abdicated on with very little notice. And so we really want to do what we can to have revenues flow to the departments and schools that encourage entrepreneurship. It's important that we manage to come up with ways of negotiating sponsored research with companies that increases the quality of the research in the eyes of the researchers and doesn't move it more toward contract research that they don't think is particularly novel or interesting. And ultimately, I think if we were good at this, of course, the holy grail is to increasingly have intellectual property development and impact considered in tenure decisions. So it may seem a little bit counterintuitive that one way to work with large companies is actually to scale up our ability to support startups and our focus on startups. But I think especially in a tight capital market where large companies are being judged and are very keenly aware of the fact that they're being judged on their quarterly performance, the alacrity with which acquisitions of non-profitable companies are made is not really what it used to be. And so often startups are actually step one toward what would have once upon a time been a license to Johnson & Johnson, in that these innovations require considerable investment before, after they leave the university, but beyond what they could achieve here, but before they would ever really attract significant interest in being part of a product or an acquisition by a large company. And of course, one benefit is that when you're thinking about a startup for a longer period of time, you have eligibility for internal support from our office and other sources, and you can be eligible for SBIR and other uniquely startup-directed sources of support. Phase 2 of SBIRs can be $2 million of non-dilutive capital, so it's very real-world material funding. And actually, when you think about what I talked about in terms of divergent motivations, I think we haven't sufficiently explored whether another solution might be mutually agreeable models where we are founding companies in partnership with large companies, and we have a mutual interest by being both of us equity holders in these startups. Other affiliated sort of phenomenon to increasing our focus on startups, especially those startups that are a step one toward basically the innovation being acquired by a large company. We're going to be partners increasingly, doing research collaborations with industry, with the innovation ecosystem, helping to, as we already have, and I'll talk a little bit about this, found new venture funds and angel groups, and helping to recruit outside financing to the region. We'd like to believe that we're going to, by spinning out many more companies, contribute to critical mass, especially in nascent sectors like alternative energy, clean tech, and those that have struggled for a while to a certain extent to achieve critical mass, life sciences. If you think about it, we're just not robust against acquisition in certain sectors, and if we had many more companies coming out of the university, we wouldn't be as hard hit when one large company that's been successful is acquired and moved out of the region. I think about Zymo Genetics and the fact that one of the articles reporting its acquisition was attempting to comfort us when the acquirer told us not to worry because they plan to keep the company here at least until 2012. And we're really trying to model ourselves out of the Utah model. Just 5 or 6 years ago, the University of Utah in Salt Lake City was, frankly, pretty mediocre statistically in generating startup companies per research dollar. And as of a couple years ago, they were tied with MIT, and last year supplanted MIT and surpassed them in terms of generating startups per research dollar. They are generating per research dollar probably 10 times as many companies as we are. So basically about 20 companies to our 10 on a research base of about 1/4 to 1/3 the federally funded dollars. And if you think about, I would say, the prestige and significance of some of the research, ours is frankly probably more significant by far. They also brought in a change agent. They changed many of the programs, much as we have, and increased the internal resources. And the one difference is that they have a much greater access internally to influencing outside funding. So they either have direct or very strongly affiliated control over a number of venture funds, and are able to cobble together as much as $1 million to what was traditionally our $50K behind the companies or spin-out prospects that they really believe in. So what is our plan for helping to achieve this successful commercialization model that works and helps us to be one of those universities that's more significant a decade from now? We're going to deepen our connections with our community. We've been known sometimes in the past for going it alone. And we're going to enhance our support at every stage of commercialization. So that's not only exceptional support for startups, which is unusual for tech transfer offices, but also very, very early support. The reason that universities tend to shy away or be loath to focus on startups is that it's much more resource intensive, it's higher risk, and it's very expensive. If you think about a license to Johnson & Johnson, if you can achieve it, and these days that's a big if, as I mentioned, you're probably going to see some payment up front. And at least you're going to recover the $100,000 that your office may have spent patenting the licensable technology. Whereas startup companies not only need you to assist them with commercialization grants and team formation and experts and all kinds of other resources, but they're going to want you, when they raise venture capital, to give them a payment plan that starts any kind of payment several years out so that you're giving them the best opportunity to attract outside capital. And you're going to receive equity in the company probably versus immediate licensing revenue. So it's a real risk that the university has taken on and being willing to put the resources behind startups. And one of the reasons we've done it is that we think that our commercially oriented researchers frankly care a whole lot more about startup opportunities than they ever did before, and not merely about licensing to existing companies. One of the things that we've been able to do is put some real sector and domain expertise in place by hiring a large number of specialists. It's something you can only do when you have an office that, like ours, is operating at great scale. So our office is about 50 to 60 people. Tech transfer offices tend to be sized pretty much commensurately with the size of the research enterprise. And as many of you know, the University of Washington basically does as much or more federally funded research as any other university in the country. And so because of that, we have this tremendous commercialization team, and because we're operating at scale, we can have specialists. If you have 7 people in your tech transfer office, chances are you can't have patent agents or someone dedicated to writing SBIR grants internally, or a director of intellectual property management who was the branch chief of tech transfer for one of the 3 NIH tech transfer offices, or venture capitalists or serial CEOs of medical biotech startups helping with your startup companies. And so we've been able to really follow a specialization strategy increasingly of late. And that's let us engage with our researchers from a much, much earlier stage, in fact, years before they may have anything to disclose, by bringing in a number of patent agents and moving all of the patent prosecution responsibility to them, contrast to the traditional tech transfer model of cradle to grave management by a technology manager. If you think about it, I think we'd all agree that a patent agent tends to have a lot more experience in everything from patent strategy to claim construction to what's appropriate billing by outside patent counsel. And by moving all of the patent prosecution away from our technology managers, one of the things we were able to do is take advantage, frankly, of our incredible technology manager specialization, because we have 15 technology managers with, in many cases, a doctorate or other advanced degree alongside a JD or MBA in a high-demand STEM area. And they're now able to devote all of their time to what they do best, which is spending a lot of time with our researchers talking about both their present-day research, but also their thoughts about prospective areas of research that they might be investigating in the future, and variations on the theme in that area, as well as, in some cases, with our more prolific researchers, entirely different areas. And we have a variety of services we can offer, again, years before there's anything necessarily to disclose. So we have technology managers who are basically the conduit, the relationship manager, to many of these specialists that I'll be talking about. And if you haven't met with a technology manager, I urge you to do it, and do it soon, because we don't really believe that there's a time that is too early to work with us. And by the way, some of them are very photogenic. So as I mentioned, we've brought in a team of industry relations officers who have just incredible experience, a couple of them 22 years in product development or commercialization leadership at HP, and in one case Weyerhaeuser. And for the most part, they're trying to do less ad hoc and more scalable programmatic efforts of the nature that I outlined earlier when I was talking about how we can work with industry on the left, affiliate programs, scheduled regular visits from industry, and long-term sponsored research relationship formation. However, they're also available to work with individual researchers to identify companies doing internal research in similar areas of focus, and to help you consider that companies holding foundational patents might actually be not obstacles, but ideal partners, collaborators, and sponsors. And then to really encourage revolving doors. And we're very lucky that the Dean of the College of Engineering spent 10 years, a decade, working in ultrasound development at GE, and really understands the value of a revolving door. There are other parts of the university that really want a researcher within the university to decide what they are, pick, and stay that thing. And so So we've got a team that is really here to facilitate the opportunity to work in industry, be exposed to product development and real customers' needs. We have a group of specialists in intellectual property management. We have a hotline that's really not so much for asking questions about your individual research and the intellectual property landscape around your area of work, but for asking immediate questions when you need to know basics in patent law. What constitutes disclosure if you're giving a talk in 2 or 3 days, or even, and it happens tomorrow? What constitutes enablement if you're thinking about whether you qualify for a provisional to fix your date of conception? And so we can answer those questions in real time, basically. And we can also help you because we have, again, at scale, in-house specialists, years before development, get a sense of the comprehensive IP landscape in which you're working, where there's blocking foundational IP, where there's technology white space. We can help you think about strategy in pursuing intellectual property as the result of your work. And also, later on, really work with you to figure out who the exactly appropriate outside counsel would be, people you're going to feel really have the specific domain expertise that's going to make you most comfortable thinking about claims. I hope that you'll love to hear that we love conflicts of interest. And what do I mean by that? Well, the last thing we'd want to do is prevent them, because I think that they're completely inherent to doing the best work here at the university and creating the startup companies with the best opportunity for success, and making sure that our faculty and graduate students enjoy all the opportunities they could enjoy anywhere else and more. And so what's key is really that we identify and manage and disclose these conflicts very early. So by way of example, if we have a senior and less senior faculty member starting a company together, where the senior faculty person who might have some input as to the newer faculty members' opportunities to achieve tenure has a financial interest in that faculty member not working toward tenure as much, but working their tail off to make the company in which they both have significant equity successful. We disclose that. We appoint a third party or a third party committee to be available to talk about it if anyone has concerns. And we're not in a position of telling someone that they don't have the right to be involved in this, and that they can't help the company that really needs their intellectual contribution. So we're really available to be very supportive, to tell you that we have ways of managing conflicts of interest, and we're supportive of the goals that these conflicts of interest usually are generated by. As I said, we've put together a crack team to support startup creation. And it's very interesting because I think that we tend, especially given the successes at CSE, frankly, to conceive of startup companies as usually being generated by repeat serial entrepreneurial faculty who have a very crystallized idea and understand the direct application of said idea and its value to the world. And yet, I think when you look at universities that are generating companies at a greater, or more prolific at doing it, often it's really more of a team approach where industry experts and entrepreneurs and residents are brought in to think about with researchers what they're doing and think about whether there might not be an application for the technology, perhaps, or an application that has a much greater market than the one that was being contemplated. And so at any rate, we have a number of services that we provide, everything from thinking out the opportunity and whether it's worthy of going forward, starting to think about who should be leading the company, how we can recruit them, how we can help you, or as an office, raise the money around that idea, and of course put together the verbal pitch, which has become the mode where, thank God, it used to be the tome of business plan with the inevitable 29 pages of business model and the hockey stick. Thank God today that's not usually desired by the folks that you're pitching. And we have two incredible directors with sector expertise. It used to be the case that we expected the same leadership to be able to help out life scientists as well as IT entrepreneurs. And the fact of the matter is that their needs are very, very different. I like to say that thank goodness in my case, two 23-year-olds can start an IT company and sometimes if they're really, really lucky, exit when they're 24. And that is not the case for the most part in biotech, where you need a lot more expertise in areas of regulation and reimbursement and clinical trial, et cetera. And so anyway, we're incredibly lucky to have Tom Clement, who in addition to being a serial CEO, is also the chairman of the Washington Biotech and Biomedical Association. So if you think about it, by definition, he's one of the very most networked people with the life science community here, and he brings all of those connections to our researchers. And on the other hand, usually in IT, there's a very different pressure to run to the marketplace, given that there's less capital needed, also, often, especially in software, to have first mover advantage, and you need someone who's thought a lot about those realities. We have an incredible team of entrepreneurs in residence. This is a new program that we started over a year ago with the first commercialization support we've ever received from the state. And it's a program where we've been able to bring really pedigreed people into the university. I think that Ed could corroborate that Ken Meyer is just a wonderful person to have working within CSE. He's the former executive director or CEO of the Washington Technology Industry Association, which used to be the WSA for those of us who've been around for a while, and a number of other folks who are really, really well known and who are generously spending a lot of their time thinking about the research that's going on here. And we actually have a flexible opportunity when it comes to that budget, where we think that something is very promising. We can actually, instead of hiring an entrepreneur at large who's looking for the next opportunity and turning over rocks themselves, we could actually hire someone specifically targeted to work with researchers around a specific pre-identified opportunity. So here's where I have to tell you that I'm guilty of, I guess because I've been in management now for a while, what would Marx have said? A disassociation from the means of production, because this morning in editing and refining this PowerPoint, I could not figure out for the life of me why this is the backdrop for this slide. And I decided that I would go within PowerPoint and find a way to remove it, and about 20 minutes later, I gave up, unable to figure out where that feature resides these days. So at least that paradigm is no longer clear to me. But at any rate, somehow a flock of geese are related to our commitment to find a winning team led by folks who are going to be highly venture financeable. And this is where we plan to increasingly do something that I think is just critical to the success we want to have in generating startup companies. We're going to be working very, very early and partnering very, very early with the venture capital firms that specialize, and it is a specialty, in working with technologies and technologists within research institutes. You know, anyone who thinks that even in more flush times that there was an auction environment for university technologies is really got it wrong. And most of the companies that have come out of the University of Washington, and with rare exceptions, other universities have really made it out because they were venture capitalists who sometimes spent years getting to know researchers and becoming comfortable with a research area and helping them think out what their next research experiments might be if they were to not only move their research ahead, but begin to reduce in some way technical risk. And so, so one of the things that we're really dedicated to doing is working with them to make sure that the people that we associate on the business side really have the pedigree and the qualifications that our researchers do, that they are their equals on the business side, and that they are the kind of leaders that venture capital investors have faith in and want to back. And actually, I wanted to say one more thing. I might be getting to it later on, but you know, one of the real startup killers is lack of momentum. And so one of the new programs that we have is a program that funds commercialization postdoctoral fellows, which means that if you have a graduate student in your lab who is the best positioned and most obvious person to help spin out a company, but has just earned their degree, that we can help fund them to stay for up to another year now that they're free of their publishing and degree earning duties, so they can exclusively work with us on getting that technology into the real world. And I think that that's a big part of what a winning team might include. So, our big premise is that venture capitalists, even in this tight capital environment where they're preserving, understandably, a lot of their capital for their portfolio companies, and where they can be choosy and select companies that are farther along in their development and even perhaps have revenue or where profitability is within sight. We think that they are still in the risk business and that there are plenty of very compelling reasons, barriers to entry, real intellectual property barriers to entry being one of them. I know in the case of one of the companies that I was raising money around in the past, I could very truthfully say that in addition to patents, there were really only 4 people in the entire world who could help do this kind of technology, and we had 3 of them. So that's the kind of thing that you can say about University of Washington derived companies that you can't always say about another social networking company coming out of another garage. So we believe that there are plenty of compelling reasons still for venture capitalists to invest in university spinouts, and yet they're more likely to want to invest in companies that are more mature than what we're achieving today with internal funding. And so, there are a number of reasons. Obviously, they'd love to see proof of concept, more technology risk reduction. But I think a larger part, maybe even still, is that venture capitalists aren't only spitting out a cliche axiom when they say that to them, team is as important as the technology or the opportunity. And it's really, I think, very difficult to invest in a company that hasn't had the funds to even hire those first 3 or 4 people so that you can get a sense of who these people are, what their qualifications are, how well they interact together, whether they're capable with very limited resources and focusing on achieving just a very few outcome determinative things, and frankly, what kind of rapport they're going to have with the investors themselves. And yet we have this gap funding challenge to getting to the point where the companies that I mentioned are presenting that kind of more mature opportunity. And despite many noble efforts, I think we still have it. We have worked with a number of outside organizations, I'll talk about that, to create additional venues for raising money. We've put together new angel groups. We've certainly internally managed to coalesce almost all of the internal funding so that we're cohesive and organized and integrated and largely concentrating funding on the most promising opportunities. And yet, probably because when you look at the Valley of Death, many of you have seen this slide a million times, while we're doing more to move across the valley this way, as I mentioned, venture capitalists have moved a little bit that way, and so the gulf is still basically as wide. We have many internal resources that we apply today to create more mature companies than we did in the past, when basically what we could offer was a $50,000 commercialization grant with very little ongoing involvement from our office. Today, our finalists for commercialization grants, which can, in some cases, be for significantly more money, are the result of a project team with entrepreneurs in residence and MBA students earning credit for researching the market opportunity and the go-to-market strategy, and patent agents looking at the IP landscape, and technology managers doing a lot of work to help define the project, creating these milestone-driven phased projects. And so just the nature of the work and the chances that they represent the very most promising projects is entirely been revamped. This is a program that the commercialization grant program that we carry out with support from the wonderful WRF. And we've teamed with many outside organizations to bring more resources to bear. So in every different category. See, now that backdrop of like green and early stage seed is like more appropriate, I think. We still work very closely with the early stage venture firms in town. I know that representatives from Madrona are here today, and they have an incredible history of having backed some of the companies that I was lucky enough to be affiliated with, and that came out of this department, and that are coming out of this department, even very recently. The Alliance of Angels has the luxury of starting to fill the space that venture capitalists have left, and also think about more mature companies than angels have traditionally looked at. And so we partnered with the Tech Alliance to create a very similarly structured innovation showcase that has showcased many University of Washington technologies, technologies that we feel are either about to spin out or appropriate for spin out. And a number of them have been financed or found financing in that venue. And then we worked with the WBBA and the WRF to found an angel group specifically around medical devices, since so many who made their money in IT and are happy and comfortable investing in the same leave the room as soon as they hear the acronym FDA. I'm one of those. You know, I know what I don't know, and you really need to get a group of life science experts in the room before they feel comfortable reinforcing each other and making investments. And lastly, because God loves the child who has their own, and we really want to be spinning out companies at scale, and not only putting together with all of our programs, commercialization, postdoctoral fellowships, commercialization grants, patent support, and other prototyping funds can now be much more, even I think, approach $300,000 of internal support, making companies more mature before they ever attract any outside funding. Not only can we write SBIR grants for our researchers, but we'd like to be in the position of cutting that first check and starting that outside investment momentum. Yeah, and so last slide, Ed. And so I think we have commitments right now for $13.5 million of the $20 million that we're seeking to raise. And if we're successful, the University of Washington would have the premier #1 student managed university affiliated venture fund in the country. Lastly, I just want to say that that's only one, and everything else we've done is only one one step toward what we think is the future that we're going to have if we're going to be at the vanguard of research universities, and that's a UW Research Park with all of these different entities present, incubator space, venture capitalists, and of course College of Engineering departments and commercialization offices in a vital zone around the university. And so the university is taking action and has quietly put down options on buildings, and this is very real. So thank you for hearing me out. We've got a number of people who work in our office in the room, and I hope that during the reception you'll search them out and begin a dialogue. And I want to thank again CSE for their passion for commercialization and for seeing I think really inspiring many of the changes that we've been able to carry out.
I have a quick question for you. It sounded like from parts of your talk today that you were, I heard it sounded like you were de-emphasizing, if not even sometimes demonizing, relationships with larger industrial research organizations. There's a lot of emphasis on startups, and I mean, you mentioned affiliates programs and things like face-to-face meetings, but I wonder what your vision would be for sort of more substantial interactions you would see with larger industrial research organizations, or what form you would imagine those taking in the future.
Well, I think not to punt, but I will say that one of the reasons we've brought in such a crack team of folks with so much experience in senior roles in very large companies is to help us figure that out by practice, because I don't think that there's a lot of gold standard out there to emulate. And that being said, there are some. So there are universities which have chosen to enter into very long-term partnerships for big dollars with individual companies. That's certainly an option. Actually, I think most of what I was saying is that we need to work much more closely with industry, find ways to collaborate, find out what they're working on internally, have them talk increasingly to our researchers so that they can do the same. And where I've thought about startups, it's largely because I believe that it's still the case that these technologies are so early that often you need a startup as a path toward the technology being integrated into a larger company. I don't see so much that these are going to be companies that end up going public as go-forward companies ultimately. If that's part of the answer at any rate.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
From our point of view, lots of C4C's time goes into helping us work on new relationships with Microsoft and Intel and licenses with established companies. So I see there being a great balance, actually.
And actually, I'm going to challenge our office and our new IRO team today to think about doing what we're able to have more industry representation in this room next year. I think that would be exactly our sweet spot of engagement.
So actually, I didn't intend for this to be a follow-on question, but I guess it kind of is. What are your thoughts about the Berkeley BP arrangement? Is that something that can work? Is it working? Obviously, it's kind of hard to tell at this point because the products are few years into the future, but can other universities emulate that? Is it a workable model? What are some of the pitfalls, I guess? Because there are some concerns that, BP is going to grab all the technology and we won't get the due benefits. Sorry, I say we because I was...
Some but not all of the details in terms of that agreement are known. It's a massive agreement, as you can imagine, with all kinds of intellectual property terms in it. And I think that universities have to decide if they're willing, in order to work with industry, to, in some cases, dedicate some intellectual property rights, or at least, first right of refusal, et cetera, to sponsoring companies, especially those that they're going to be working with for a long time. I think one very real risk of doing that is that you might diminish your chances of attracting the very best researchers in the world if they feel that that will unreasonably restrict their opportunities. And of course, as I said, no great researchers, no great inventions. On the other hand, one fascinating and maybe unforeseen result of that BP deal was that because they were then positioned to be the expert institution in the subject area, they won a tremendously large, I can't remember, was it $100 million center from the Department of Energy very soon after that. And so there was tremendous follow-on benefit. So I definitely think we're going to be exploring partnerships of that nature, and this is the thing universities have to get their arms around, right? That to work with BP maybe not to work with Chevron.